Okay, it said we'd be talking about sustainable development and issues like that, but I'll be talking more about environmental justice, which I'll define and explain a little bit later, but I think it'll be a good change of pace for everybody. I won't be talking about any tech issues. There will not be anything about technology and how it's implemented to help solve climate change and all these existential issues, but I will be talking about something that is just as pressing, and that is the issue of environmental justice. So my name is Gavin Taves. I'm an urban and environmental planner. I'm from Chicago. I work for the Chicago Housing Authority doing development work, so looking at large-scale urban development of public and affordable housing in the city. Right now, I'm doing a couple fellowships and working on environmental planning in the city, working with environmental justice issues, looking at how climate change and local environmental effects are disproportionately impacting people of color, those who are in the LGBTQ plus community, those who are lower on the income scale. And I kind of got called into this through a series of experience through life and then professional instances as well. So when I was young, I spent, all of my time outside, flipping over stones, looking at like fun bugs underneath anything I could find, just admiring nature for what it was. My mom, who's actually here right now, she's right here, was involved in a major conservation campaign when I was younger called Take a Pass on Chilean Sea Bass, which was a campaign to get people to stop eating the Chilean sea bass, which is an endangered fish. It worked really well and was a very inspirational moment for me as a young kid, which was incredible. I saw her on TV doing all this amazing work, and it made a big impact. And that was something that I looked at and said, I would aspire to do that. That's incredible. So I've worked in city government in various capacities for a while, doing work with environmental issues, working through national environmental regulation to make sure that projects that we do at the CHA are environmentally responsible, protecting people from certain environmental conditions. When I was invited here today, I said, okay, what can I provide to a room full of really smart people who definitely know about, like what climate change is. You guys have probably a basic understanding of what's going on environmentally in the world. You guys have this knowledge already. You are all very smart. You're working at Google. You've all done a great job. You've gotten here. Congratulations. I'm going to provide a little bit something different for you. And hopefully you can take some of this knowledge and take some things that you learn and kind of employ that within your life and in your day-to-day. And I'll tell you why environmental justice is really important for everyone. So we're going to be talking about a few things. So the structure of the presentation is we're going to go over what equity means and what equality means, and what the difference is between those two and how they impact people. I'm going to introduce you to what environmental justice is, how it plays out across the Chicagoland region specifically, but we're going to talk about just what environmental justice is, how it operates in the world. And then I'll talk a little bit about my work, how I employ environmental justice to promote, beneficial outcomes for particularly vulnerable residents who live in public housing and in affordable housing. And at the end, I'm going to do a little takeaway section and then provide a 7-point blueprint for how everybody in this room after today can do just a few things that will make an actual tangible impact on the world. Just 7 things that everybody can do. So hopefully we can all walk away feeling a little bit more informed and a little bit more motivated to make a difference. So let's jump in. So for definitions, this is a really common slide that people use when they talk about equality. So people across this country who have been disenfranchised or been discriminated against start off at different starting points when they're born. Not everybody was born the same. We all know that. There's wealth that's been distributed to certain groups of people. The color of your skin determines what success you can have in society. So when we talk about equality in terms of a program or a benefit that people receive, if everyone receives the same amount of a benefit across society, those who start off at a lower point sometimes don't have access to the game, which are the systems that we all participate in. However, those who started off at a much higher point, somebody who has access to education, who has access to money, they had access to the game, but now they have even more access. They have more access to wealth, more access to higher education, more access to the other benefits, including environmental benefits, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is equality and an equal basis with which people are lifted up. Now, when we talk about equity, we're talking about proportional benefit that people receive in society. What this means is that those with the most already aren't given even more protection or even more of a benefit for something. And this system means that those that start off with the least just get access to the game. They're not getting more than anybody else, but they're getting access to view the game, to participate in society. And we'll talk about what reality really looks like. So this is what it's like when you start off as a person of color in America, or you start off somebody who's poor. You start off with a natural disadvantage. You're literally in the ground before you even start. And those with the most are often rewarded for having the most. It's a system that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense when you're thinking about how do we get as many people involved in society as possible. But let's run to an example and see what this all looked like. So in 1970, and this is a very funny thing in environmental planning that we all talk about, but Richard Nixon actually founded the EPA in 1970. It's a very, I don't know why. I guess it was like a low-hanging fruit for him. Everybody kind of agreed with it. So in 1970, the EPA was formed, the Environmental Protection Agency. And in their first year, they developed the Clean Air Act, which set standards across the country for air pollution. And this meant that people couldn't just build a factory, pump out as much smoke as they wanted and not care about the issue. They had certain limits on everything to protect people from asthma, infant mortality, other things like that. So what we see here is a chart about the benefits, and we're not going to have a lot of numbers in this, so this will be like the one thing, so bear with me, that shows the benefits of the, okay, good, the Clean Air Act across time. And so we'll be looking at the benefits from 1990 to 2020. So the PM 2.5, which is what we're looking at, that's particulate matter, and that is stuff that comes out of engines when fuel is burned. These are particularly dangerous for people. They can cause all kinds of health complications that can end up killing you. So before the Clean Air Act was created, people were dying all the time, and our airs did not, or our air and our atmosphere did not look the same as it does now. We take it for granted, but there was a lot of work that was done. For adult mortality from this particulate matter, PM 2.5, since 1990, there will be an estimated 230,000 lives that have been saved. So this is an equal benefit that has been spread across society and has deterred or made sure that 230,000 people are alive today that wouldn't be otherwise. For infants, for literal babies, it's 280 in total, which, I mean, is still a significant number. We don't want any babies dying in society. This is a wonderful thing. It's been spread across the country and people are benefiting. So let's look at the other side. So that was an equal program that was spread as a standard across society. But when we talk about equity, an equitable solution for environmental issues, the situation is very different. On the left-hand side here, we have a map that shows, it's like a demographic and income index. So what it means is that the areas in red, or if you can see in the ascending or descending scale here, the areas that are gray have fewer people of color and fewer people who are in the lower income brackets. As you descend to red, they have more and more. So the areas that are densely red or yellow or orange have many people of color and many people who are in the lower income brackets. On the right-hand side, we're going to go with the index that we looked at before with the particulate matter, the thing that causes a lot of respiratory issues and kills people. It was in the air a lot. You can see concentrations of this, again, descending order, high concentrations across the city. And so what happens when you do a little comparison, you see that the areas that have some of the most susceptible, vulnerable people in society are actually the areas that are still getting hit the most with particulate matter. So how could it be that in our society, when we have the Clean Air Act, when we have all these standards, that people of color, the poor people in society, and those that are most vulnerable are still getting hurt? How could we have that when standards have already been imposed? And so we look at is that equity, environmental equity, is a totally different ballgame. It's a different situation. So here, for example, a short history about what's going on. Between the 1920s and 1960s, there was a massive migration called the Black Migration from the south of the US. There were a lot of former sharecropping families, people who lived in southern states, who moved up to the Northeast, the Midwest, and to the West, a lot in California as well. And they came to live sometimes in Chicago. So when they moved here, there was a then legal, now very illegal practice by real estate developers called redlining. And it forced certain communities of color into areas that were poorer or less desirable. White families who were there, because of their racist tendencies primarily, fled and they went to the suburbs. All of that wealth left those areas as well. So what happens is that all of these people who have come up just looking for a better life are forced to live in communities that don't have resources, they aren't safe, and they're all concentrated in certain areas. And then what we see is that these areas become hotbeds for industrial activity. So factories move in because the land is cheap, because that area has been devalued by real estate developers. So all of a sudden, these areas that have literally the most vulnerable people in society that you could choose, they are now more susceptible to something like particulate matter, because they're burning fuel to produce things, and then the people of color and those who don't have money to move are left there. And they don't move because they can't. So this is a situation where it's, there are equity issues, even though we have environmental standards. It doesn't make a difference to the people who live by the factories if they're forced to. So this is just one example, but we're going to dive a little bit more. So for the definition of environmental justice, which is kind of that last slide and everything we just talked about, environmental justice, it's essentially the engagement and fair treatment of people regarding environmental policy in the United States specifically, but around the world, regardless of race, income, color, or any other external characteristic that doesn't make a difference except for the cultural and systemic pressure that we put on people. It's just engaging people on an equitable basis and making sure that we're all protected to the same degree. So we're going to look at environmental justice in our society a little bit. What we're going to do is, I work in public housing. We're going to look at areas that have a lot of public housing in the city, and then we're going to look at the environmental effects on the other side. So right here is the current distribution of public and affordable housing. And what this means is that people below a certain income level qualify to live in public and affordable housing. The agency that I work for provides that housing for people. Right here, this is the concentration of housing across. Here is air pollution, again, looking at particulate matter specifically right now across the city. So like we looked at before, the areas at high concentrations of public housing, again, housing the people that don't have the money to move, they have to live in these places. And also at the same time, it's primarily housing people of color who have been discriminated against and disenfranchised throughout society. Look at what levels of contamination, air contamination there are. I mean, again, we're seeing the same trends. The most vulnerable people live in the most environmentally precarious areas. It's a huge issue. So another example, let's just quickly look at lead contamination. Lead was used in paint chips, in housing all across the United States. And this is a horrifying fact, but that lead is actually sweet. So what happened is that kids would eat the lead paint off the walls, and the chips can actually lead to neurodegenerative effects, and they can cause people to become more violent or more upset, don't do well in school. They can't focus as well because they're literally having mental health issues due to the sweet paint that was on the walls, and no one said anything about it. So lead contamination has a very real effect on communities. I mean, you can see the numbers. I mean, the chart speaks for itself. This is lead concentration or issues of lead contamination in housing stock. Where's our public housing? I mean, it's pretty stark. Hazardous waste. Gas stations are everywhere. They're extremely dangerous. They leak all kinds of contamination into the soil. Kids go into that soil. They eat the soil. People grow things in the soil. They touch it all the time. If you have a factory that's not, following standards or protocol, they're releasing all kinds of stuff there. What do we see? Heavy contamination in everywhere that is housing the people that need help the most and that deserve environmental protection. And these are just a couple things. I could go on. I mean, this is just the situation, and it's bad. It's bleak, and it shows that environmental justice is not being served to the people who deserve it and who need it the most. And really, what it says is that people of color and the less wealthy in society specifically haven't been allotted the right protection that everybody else has been given, just because of certain external characteristics that like society has pushed on them. And that is the idea of environmentally unjust outcomes. So what am I doing to look at this issue? What kind of work do I do? Because, I just talked all about this. It seems like such a dire issue. What can we do? There are things that we can do. And there are a lot of people thinking about solutions across the world and across the country and in Chicago. So I'm sorry, I'll go back for a second. Right now, I'm developing a housing resiliency plan, and this is aiming to develop policy and design initiatives that will look at how climate change will affect public housing residents in the future, and then also looking at what other local environmental effects already exist that will be multiplied by climate change. So all this is going to hit every city, everywhere in the world. Different places will experience it differently, but everybody will be affected. The plan will help look at where we're most vulnerable, how we can change our programs and our physical developments to protect our people. And again, this is like specifically to fight environmental injustice. So for the first phase, excuse me, we're going to be looking at an environmental vulnerability assessment. What this means is looking at historical issues that have already plagued Chicago. This is looking at major flooding, heat waves, intense storms that have already hit. When those increase, we need to know what damage has already been done. How are we most vulnerable to these effects? So we're going to look at, how did people fare during major heat waves? So there was a major heat wave in the 1990s. It killed hundreds of elderly people in the city of Chicago. A lot of those people lived in public housing. What happened? Why did they not have the resources to get to a cooling center? What took place that led to those deaths? Who was hurt? Who was killed? Was it the elderly? Was it infants? Was it single mothers? What demographic specifically was hurt the most? And then we'll use that research to determine which residents were hurt, what programs failed, and what physical infrastructure failed. And this is to help build out the existing resiliency capacity of the CHA, the Chicago Housing Authority. So again, where did the infrastructure fail? And if it didn't fail, what did we do right? That's the capacity we're looking for. And so within this, there are several slices of the resiliency pie, if you will, that we can look at. We're going to be saying, what is our capacity mainly in environmental issues, but it takes the whole pie to create a resilient community. So we'll look at environmental quality. We're going to look at parks and recreation, but everything overlaps. So we're going to see, how does the CHA provide resilient communities for our people? And then how will that protect them in the future? And while it may not seem intuitive, there are things like transportation options. How does that relate to like environmental injustice? And how does that relate to anything to do with climate change adaptation or whatever? But if you think about this, if there were buses running every 5 minutes in front of our public housing centers, and people need to get out and get to a cooling center because the electricity in their housing development is out, if they can jump on a bus every 5 minutes and get there, they'll be safe. But if they can't, and they're stuck there, then it's a whole other issue. So you can see these things, they overlap with one another. And so the final step will be looking, at the vulnerability assessment, who was hurt, what failed, what is our capacity to actually protect people, and then looking at the future resiliency potential and recommendations. And these will be specific policy and project initiatives that will be able to protect people and protect our developments. And we have some examples of this that have already been explored in the industry. I'm talking about power redundancy in buildings. If there's a major storm, a major flood, if the power goes out, how do we protect people? What kind of generators are in place to make sure that everybody's safe? Planting trees. You know, trees have these incredible benefits. They're some of the most amazing natural assets that we have. A tree can absorb stormwater. They can provide something called evapotranspiration, which means that they release water up into the air, and it actually cools the ambient temperature of an area. If there's a heat wave and you have a forest of trees, you'll be comfortable. You'll be fine. You have shade, and you have cooling from these the evapotranspirative effects, and it's wonderful. So, what kind of tree planting campaigns can we engage in? And again, like, what's the protocol with the Office of Emergency Management? You know, how do we engage with other agencies in the city to make sure that we're protecting our people when there are disasters? There's a lot of stuff we can look at. So those are just a few examples. And again, this is very much in its nascent phase. We're building a team to do this, but it's exciting work. It's really exciting, and it's showing that people do care, and they're focusing on these issues, which is wonderful. So the goal is just to achieve these environmentally just outcomes for people using the policy and design initiatives to fight against environmental shocks and stressors. And if any of that spoke to you, that idea, there's a campaign called the 100 Resilient Cities campaign by Michael Bloomberg. He started this enormous fund with his large amounts of cash, which is wonderful. He is going to make or allow cities to produce their own like resiliency plans going into the future. So they have tons of really cool work, great graphics. It's really interesting. Yeah, so let's do some takeaways. Number one, this is, I think, one of the most important things for us all to think about in society, not just with environmental issues. Equality does not meet equity. So even if something is equally distributed, or you hear about, you know, a program, let's say like if you're listening to the news one day and you hear that, I don't know, let's say Social Security benefits have been given to everybody over the age of 65 who needed it, but then you hear that some people are still dying or something. You say, well, why? You know, why would they be still getting hurt when everybody's receiving the same benefit? You have to remember that there are certain things in society, certain pressures, certain levels of disenfranchisement that make groups of people who have different external characteristics, or maybe sometimes internal, like your race, color, how much wealth you have, makes them more susceptible. So equal benefits do not provide equal outcomes. Not everybody will have access to the game, but equitable benefits, when you're looking at equity, it will give everybody access to the systems that we all deserve to participate in as Americans and as people in the world. And remember that this really is what it looks like for so many issues, for education, for income distribution, and then for environmental reasons like we just explored. Number two, environmental issues and their effects are not experienced or distributed equally by any means. Just remember that all of these issues overlap with one another. And it's really important to remember that if you look a different way, where you don't have as much money, you may have a much higher risk of developing asthma later in life, things like that. It's just because of what you look like. I mean, that's the definition of injustice. I mean, that's not what any of us stand for, but it's mainly because we don't know about it enough. So educating yourself and learning about how environmental issues are distributed is really important. And finally, not to be hokey or whatever, like planet picture and stuff, but it is the truth. Like we are in this together. That, you know, no one's coming to save us from climate change or any local environmental issues. It is just us. You know, we're our only defense against whatever's going to happen. You know, these are the defining issues of our time, and it takes collective action from every individual, regardless of how little it seems, to make a difference. And you guys in the audience, like everybody here, your friends are the ones that have the most privilege and the greatest platform to make a difference. Like you all know, I mean, how many friends do each of you have on Facebook? Well, like 1,500, 2,000, maybe more. I mean, we all have these amazing networks all the time. We have social media. We can spread knowledge about this. Like this has to be collective in order to make a difference. And we can do it because we already are. Again, I told you I was going to give you some takeaways, and we are going to do it right now. So number one, this is a huge, huge issue. And I'm not going to dive too deep in all this stuff, but your house and your residence general accounts for about 10% of your carbon emissions. Switch to a clean energy provider like Arcadia Power. I'm not sponsored or anything, whatever. I just put it up there because I like it. I use it. It means fewer emissions. That's fewer environmental effects on people who are more vulnerable in society. That's a direct impact on the issue of environmental justice. Number two, if you think you don't have time, you don't want to dive into these issues on the political level or whatever, donate to your local environmental nonprofit. You have something called Environment Texas, which has a headquarters in Austin. Great organization that does a lot of advocacy work here. Or your local Sierra Chapter Club, $5 a month. Super simple. It's one cappuccino. Do that once a month and you can make a huge difference. Pay the people who will fight for you. They will. This is a really big one, and I think we don't talk about this enough. I'm assuming all of us fly, drive a car pretty frequently, maybe not the car part. A lot of airlines offer this option to pay a small fee and offset all of the emissions related to your travel. This, again, has direct impacts on environmental justice. Emissions cause climate change. Climate change causes things like sea level rise. There are countries, many Pacific Island countries, for example, don't have the resources to leave their area. If the water rises too much, they can't leave. That's something that we're directly contributing to. So if you can, buy this offset. There's a company called TerraPass. TerraPass.com offers offsets that are really great. They do things like planting trees to capture carbon from the atmosphere. Reduce your consumption of animal products. We have some great advocates here talking about plant-powered everything, which is awesome. I myself am vegan. It's wonderful. I'm not proselytizing. It's just really fun. So if you can reduce your consumption, it's great. 10% of all emissions are related to animal agriculture. And people don't really talk about this, but a lot of these industrialized animal agriculture systems, they don't only hurt the animals that are slaughtered there. The workers who work there are mistreated terribly. It's a really big issue. So this is a great way to just make an impact. Support your local agriculture. There's something called localharvest.org. You can look up Austin, Texas, and it'll show you all kinds of local farms you can buy into a co-op. Very cheap, great option for doing all this. And again, this helps reduce the emissions related to transporting agriculture and goods all over the country. It's a great option, and it helps promote local businesses too, which is awesome. You guys want a strong economy here. Reduce your waste. Obviously, a lot of these are obvious, but your reusable bottles. You guys are great. You have a very sustainable campus. Really cool. Reusable grocery bags. Avoid items wrapped in plastic. Blah blah blah. Don't throw so much away. It's bad for the world. Don't do it. And finally, this is by far the most important thing. You have to vote. Please tell 10 of your friends to go vote. Take your grandma, take your aunt, take your sister, whoever, I don't care. Get them to the polls and get them to vote for people. You had a really important election in Texas recently, right? I think there was somebody called Beto O'Rourke or something running. Ted Cruz was running. If Beto won, there would have been some different outcomes for Texas and for who votes for environmental policy. We have the most powerful country on earth still. I know maybe our leadership isn't the best right now, but we have some of the most powerful tools at our disposal, and our Congress is the most powerful deliberative body that exists. When you vote for people who are pushing forth progressive values that will protect everybody, you are making the biggest difference you can make. And I do believe that this is the most important thing that we can do. We all have privilege and platforms to make a difference. We know that there are a lot of smart people who aren't doing enough on Earth. All of us in this room can do more, myself included. I am, just as complicit in not acting as much as I should. But we do have this collective responsibility. We all live on this planet, and there are people who have less than us, who are of fewer means and less means, who are disproportionately impacted by the things that we contribute to. There's a moral case for this. This is about life or death. It's about livelihood. It's a really important issue. It touches everybody, and it will touch you eventually, regardless of whether you think it will or not. Climate change, local environmental issues, they're everywhere, and it's just the truth. You can't avoid it. If you don't believe in climate change, we can talk about this afterwards. I'll have a panel outside or something. It's like what I do for my life. So, but yeah, it's everywhere. It's pervasive. There's a moral case for it. And yeah, so hopefully I introduce you guys to some new topics of environmental justice, about equity and what that means for society, and not just for environmental issues. And yeah, I'm really open to any questions that anybody has. I have tried to hack my own life to make it as sustainable as possible. So I have a lot of ideas about what that means. So please email me if you want it. I'll make a little toolkit for everybody for Austin about this. I hope that would be helpful. So I can send it to you all after this if you would like. But yeah, a little over time, but thank you for all coming. Oh, yes, I will be at TGIT. Yeah, later. I think I'll have a booth. Is that what's going on? I'll have a little booth. I can answer questions, whatever people need. But I will be there. Yeah, I can maybe take 2 questions. Is that okay? Or a couple questions if anybody has anything. Connor, hit me.
Yeah. Regarding hazardous waste disposal.
Yeah.
I'm sure the city of Chicago has a variety of regulations that dictate the proper channels or methods to dispose of that waste.
Sure.
So is that not being enforced? Are those regulations not sufficient? How are businesses either penalized or incentivized conversely to follow those regulations?
It's a really good question. So there are standards now, but there weren't standards before. So there were companies all across the country who would bury their toxic chemicals in tanks. We call them underground storage tanks, USTs. Those things were put underground before there was regulation. They leak into the surrounding soil, contaminates it. People didn't know, they don't know now. You have to then dig it up, explore it, do all that. So now there are very strict regulations. You can't just dump anything anywhere. But there's so much that has already happened that there's a lot of work to be done. Yeah.
Is there any concern that as climate change continues to worsen, that we'll get to a point where the mindset will be we're in such disarray that equality and equity gets thrown out the door and just people start running at what's going to reduce the most carbon emissions, and how close do you think we are to that?
So I don't mean to be depressing when I say this, but I think that we are already living in that paradigm. The fact that most people don't know what environmental justice is, or that people of color or low-income people are already disproportionately affected, means that we're already losing the battle. And there are a lot of companies that have these very greenwashing terms where it says we recycle 5% of our plastic. We're contributing. It's well, you're not. I mean, you're doing a part, that's great, but in a way that they should be doing it would be we're employing 20% of our workforce from areas that are underserved by the city, and we're making sure that those communities are resilient in stabilizing them. That would mean local urban agriculture, waterproofing homes, that's the kind of work. So I think you're right that people will be focusing on those bigger issues, and then a lot of the social justice and racial equity issues related to environmental problems will be pushed aside, because I think they already are. Sorry, that was a just depressing answer, but I have more positive things to say too. Anyone else? Yeah, please.
When the evidence
Thanks,
is
Anders.
so obvious and you are making, what could they possibly say to justify that action should continue?
When you're speaking with policymakers or change makers, what could they even say to tell you that this isn't happening, or that it's not? Is that right? This isn't
it's not worth changing.
Not worth changing.
It's the evidence is just so obvious that something needs to be done. I don't just care. Obviously, they aren't doing anything, so
Yeah.
there are things being said. So I'm just curious, like, what does that look like? What do they say?
Yeah, so the thing is, Chicago is a very liberal city, and I hate to break it down by political allegiance, but I think this does break down that way a lot. I mean, they believe the science in our city, so they say, you know, change needs to be made. They know the impact it's having on people, and they're going to do it. But there are people who are so skeptical of the science of any of this, especially the social science. They don't. I don't want to say they. There are a lot of people and a lot of politicians who believe that racial equity is not, or racial inequity is not real, that color is a made-up concept that doesn't really affect people, which is exactly what they would say because they're the ones that perpetuate that idea. They don't want to believe this because it means that things like our capitalist system that produces goods or has made certain people wealthy has failed other people and like spectacularly failed them. So they just claim other evidence and they say this isn't real. It's not really affecting them. If they wanted to, they could move away from areas that are dangerous. And it's just ignoring so much of the evidence. But it's easier to keep yourself ignorant. I mean, and that's a way to tell your constituents that like it's all made up if you just don't choose to look into it. And that is what happens a lot. Did that answer your question, or is there more?
Even I don't know, like that graphic you showed, like maybe it would show so something like that to make it make sense.
Yeah.
I guess it's just don't understand how.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard to rationalize when you see it and you're like, if you think about it logically, like why wouldn't this be the case? But it stinks. A lot of people they just don't believe it's real. There's a lot of convincing to do, which is like another reason why I wanted to come here and talk to people. Thank you for asking, though. It's an important question. Yeah. Yes, please.
I worked in the area. I worked on worked on persons of color all over the United States.
Amazing.
And what we found is that if you go to a city council or a county or whatever, the most the answer you'll get most often is we don't have a budget. We would like to do this. Even they do a lot of gaslighting. So that's what you're talking about.
The gaslighting, yeah.
But then what they'll tell you is, we'd really like to make a difference here. We want this safe, we want them, right?
Yeah, that's totally right.
And then, but we don't have the budget for it, which is an economic analysis that is very short-sighted.
Yeah.
And it's wrong. It's based on yes.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't reflect the reality of how money is generated and spent.
Yeah.
And the underlying biases and racism that are in fact there, they're not going to acknowledge that.
Right.
So the easy answer is we don't have money. You show us where we can get the money to do this. That's what they do. They throw it back on you. You show me where I can get the money to dig up all of these polluting factors, and then we'll do it. So they gaslight and they throw it back on the people who are most affected by it, who have no ability to do that. They
Sure. And it's so funny. I'll come to you in a second. It's so funny because it makes this false equivalency between like economic or like economic forecasting, budgeting, and then the lives of people or their health. And it's like, are you telling me that you're putting everybody's life into an economic system and like that's how we're going to value this out? Like, why doesn't Flint have water? Why doesn't it have water yet? How many years has it been? How much time has it spent in the news? I can tell you right now, those people are not valued as much as other people in society. Like that is environmental justice incarnate. Like that's it in one city. Like it's what it is. They don't want to spend the money. How many millions of dollars is it going to take to replace those pipes? I guarantee if it was a wealthy suburb outside Detroit, guarantee that situation would be different. Well, did you have a question?
Just a quick question. Of course, we're from the same place. So
I think I know you, yeah.
Also,
My question is, I get all that. The Appalachian populations, the people kind of stuck up who aren't of color and who are still really struggling and suffering as well. And how do they fit into this mix? And have you studied that?
Absolutely. They fit directly into it because those people have had their livelihoods and their wealth stripped away from them as well from false promises related to industries that have failed since then. So while they are not people of color who face that discrimination, they are poor. They're poor in our society, and that means that you face discrimination as well. So the environmental justice isn't about just race.
That is concentrated, that are they suffering the same other, I understand the mindset now, shut down, so they're not suffering. But are they suffering the same kinds of injustice as the cities?
I would never make a false, not a false, I would never make an equivalency between suffering between people. I don't know if that's like my place to do it, but
I mean, like
the scale.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, there's like miner's lung. That's like people die from the black lung from working in the coal mines, and like they were in horribly environmentally dangerous situations all the time. I don't have the data on me to say what the numbers are compared to the two groups, but they've both experienced environmental injustice 100%. Yeah, definitely. It's not all about color, but a lot of it has to do with it because it correlates a lot with generational wealth and things like that. Anything else? I don't want to keep anybody for too long, but any other questions? Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm here for questions later. So yeah, thank you all. Appreciate it. Just click stop recording.